of your GoToWebinar screen, and Sarah also mentioned it when she was giving the information earlier. So speaking of Sarah, today I will be working with Sarah. She'll be monitoring the questions and ensuring everything goes well from a technical perspective. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Sarah for helping to run this webinar and making sure everything goes smoothly. So today she has given everyone temporary access to the MedDRA browser. So this is especially helpful for those that don't have access to their own browsers. Of course, if you have access to your own browser, feel free to use that, your organization's browser, whatever the case may be. So the information for the temporary browser can be found in the chat area, as Sarah mentioned earlier. So please be sure to log in before we begin, as it will help to make the class a little more fun and interactive, and you could follow along while I go through certain information, especially when I do a little browser demo later on in the presentation. You can kind of follow along with me, whether you're using a web-based browser or a desktop browser, and kind of, it always, for me, it helps to, when you're following along in real time, it helps to kind of trigger memory and remember things after the class is done, because typically there's a lot of information given, so it helps to have a little way to trigger your memory, at least for me anyway. So with that being said, let me introduce myself. My name is Nicole Fornerato. I'm a clinical associate with the MSSO. I'm based in northern New Jersey in the New York City metropolitan area. Today, I'm coming to you from a very, very cold, kind of almost winter day, cloudy day here. I like to give a little weather report since we're also international in these calls. But anyway, I joined the MSSO about 4.5 years ago. And before that, I, like all of you, was a MedDRA user in the industry. I worked in both clinical and safety or post-marketing environments, using MedDRA in a variety of different roles. So I was once in your shoes, creating customized queries and using SMQs and ensuring the data was available to me, ensuring the data available to me was handled in a way to best facilitate analysis. So hopefully I can take you on a fun kind of journey to learn more about SMQs and how you can actually use them in your day-to-day. All right, so before we begin, we have to do this standard slide that was developed to inform our users that MedDRA was developed under the ICH, and all activities of the MedDRA Maintenance and Support Services Organization, or MSSO, are overseen by the ICH MedDRA Steering Committee. This presentation is protected by a copyright, and if the presentation is used in any fashion, the ICH copyright must be acknowledged at all times, and if it's used, any changes that take place must be clearly identified, and any impression that the ICH has endorsed these changes must be avoided. So you can, take this presentation and, use it or pass it along. Just please don't, if you make any changes, you have to document that. Okay, so getting to the course overview. So today we'll be going through a variety of topics relating to SMQs. We will start with a content review of the MedDRA data retrieval, PTC, or points to consider document. And for those of you that may have attended the data analysis and query building webinar that Dr. Dave did last week, this may look a little familiar to you. We won't spend a bunch of time on it. We're just gonna go through a couple important points within it at the very beginning. We will also discuss the features of SMQs, including background and data characteristics, the impact of MedDRA versioning when dealing with SMQs, as well as some benefits and limitations around SMQs. I will also be performing a demo on the SMQ analysis tool. Not sure if many of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, don't worry. By the end of today, you'll be at least a little familiar with it, where to find it, and some of the features it does have. It's found within the MedDRA browser. I will also be going through some practical applications for SMQs, as well as 2 clinical scenarios for the use of SMQs. I will briefly touch upon the creation of customized queries. Since this is a topic that's covered in more detail, like I mentioned, there was a webinar last week, and we do have other classes around more in-depth data analysis and customized query building classes. So today we'll just touch upon it because SMQs and CMQs do sometimes go hand in hand. And as I mentioned, I will be taking questions throughout today's class, but we'll also be leaving some time at the end in case there are any additional questions that might come up. Okay, so with all of the logistics out of the way, let's get started by going through a brief overview of the MedDRA data retrieval and presentation PTC. It's a great tool for when coding is complete and it's time to start looking at the data from an analysis perspective. So the data retrieval and analysis PTC is a great tool. Like I mentioned, we won't spend too much time going through this today. We'll be focusing mainly on SMQs, but one key feature of the document is that it provides options for data retrieval and presentation for both industry as well as regulatory purposes. It's most effective when used in conjunction with the MedDRA term selection points to consider, as it's best to perform analysis on properly coded data, right? So whatever analysis you are performing, it needs to be on data that was already coded, and it's always best to have properly coded data, right? So that's why those documents go hand in hand. So as with the term selection PTC, the data retrieval PTC is recommended to be used as the basis for an individual's own data retrieval conventions. So if you have not read this document, I would highly recommend taking some time to read it. I would also recommend creating an internal data retrieval document which specifies your organization's way of analyzing data if you have not already done so. I would just like to add those little recommendations in that you can kind of use moving forward. So as with the term selection PTC, the data retrieval PTC is also released once a year in March. So the document is developed by a working group of the ICH, and it is available in several languages, including English, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Spanish, and Russian. The PTC documents can be found by navigating to the MedDRA.org homepage. I'll show you that real quick now, just give you a little example. So we're on www.meddra.org here. And if you go over, scroll over to the upper right-hand corner where you see PTC, you can click on that and the points to consider documents will pop up. As you can see here, we have the points to consider document as well as the MedDRA data retrieval and presentation points to consider document. We also have a red line version available, which documents any changes from 1 year to the next year, since we do the updates once a year in March. So these are good documents. You know, they're available in Word, and in the actual document is also available in a PDF. So you can feel free to open that. It will just, if you click on it, I can show you real quick. It will just pop open and you can save it wherever you like on your computer. Took a second. There it goes. You should be able to see it now. And you can scroll through lots of good information in there, some of which we'll be going through today. So just as a reference point, that's where you can find those documents. Okay, so now we'll go into a brief overview with regards to the information a document contains. So as you can see from the slide, there are a lot of points addressed. Today, specifically, we will be focusing on the points that pertain to SMQs. So one general main point from the document is quality of source data is key because it determines everything else from how something will be coded to how it will be analyzed, right? So like I mentioned, the quality of source data and then also the coding of the data, right? And then once all that's done, then you move on to the analysis piece with the data. So within the document, there is also guidance around general queries and retrieval SMQs, which is our main focus for today. So again, I won't spend a lot of time going through upversioning today, as we touched upon it in other webinars, and it's not our main focus. But if this is your first webinar with me, or just as a refresher, MedDRA is updated twice a year. So a new version is released in March, and one is released in September on the first of each month. The released versions are typically implemented the first Monday, 60 days after their release, which equates to the first Monday in May and the first Monday in November. So in March, the 0.0 or the major release is released, and that can affect all levels of the MedDRA hierarchy. And then in the fall, which we're kind of in the middle of right now, or actually just got through it, I should say, because I can't believe we're actually in the middle of November right now. But so we just got through the 8 weeks, but the 0.1 release that comes out is September 1st. That's considered more a minor release, as it can only affect terms at the LLT or PT level. It's not the whole hierarchy. So the MSSO has created many resources around upversioning to help make what can be an overwhelming process less overwhelming, right? They provided what's new document, a version report, as well as created the MVAT tool, all of which are valuable tools to help with performing versioning. The most important takeaway from this slide is the last piece of information. The terms used for queries, or SMQ, either SMQ or homegrown, should always be in the same version as the coded data, right? So this is very important, as signals can potentially be missed if measure PTs don't match the data being queried. So whatever you use to query your data after it's coded, that query should match the same version as the data. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go through today's presentation. So again, this slide it's just here to show you that we do have a couple browsers available. We have a desktop browser, we have a web-based browser, and we have a mobile MedDRA browser. And the web-based browser can be accessed, the one that Sarah gave you access to today, if you don't have your own access, by again going to www.meddra.org, and here in the upper right hand corner you just click on WBB, and then you can log in. My information's automatically populated, but you can log in with the temporary credentials Sarah gave you, or your own credentials if you have them. And again, I'm in English because unfortunately that's the only language I do speak, but you can feel free to follow along in a language if you're more comfortable with, if you have a first language that you like to use, and we have it available. As you can see, there are many languages available in the web-based browser. So just to get you set up with the browser. Okay, so now we will dive into everything you ever wanted to know with regards to SMQs. I'm sure, you know, it can be a hot topic at organizations, right, and analyzing data. So before we begin, I just want to take a brief pause, give everybody a chance to log into the browser, and then see if there are any questions.
We do not have any questions at this time.
Okay, good. So hopefully everyone's following along with no issues. That's great. All right, so now we'll get started with the good stuff. Okay, so what is a query? So it's not that simple to analyze signals, whether it's in safety or clinical. It's also critical, right, to get it right, to get these signals right. So a query is quite simply a tool to help analyze these signals. So when dealing with MedDRA coded data, a query is a set of terms, typically PTs, as analysis of data is done at the PT level. They help to identify any potential signals or patterns in data. So queries can be SMQs, like I mentioned, standardized MedDRA queries, or queries can also be a CMQ or a customized MedDRA query, or maybe your organization has another great name for these homegrown kind of queries. Lots of organizations kind of put their own spin on what they want to name it. Some just stick to CMQ. So it all means the same thing at the end of the day. It's a query that you built internally to help analyze your data outside of what the MSSO built, the SMQs that we're going to go through today. So what is an SMQ and why do we need them? So typically organizations have large databases. So within those large databases, it's important not to miss small signals. So that's a very important piece of information I'm sure we're all aware of, right? Most organizations have extremely large databases, and in that you can have a very small signal, small amount of data that may equate to a signal. So because of this, it has been recognized that tools are needed to detect safety signals that are complex and manifest themselves through various signs and symptoms. So this is where the importance of SMQs lies, right? So SMQs have been designed to detect these signals. So what exactly is an SMQ? So a standardized MedDRA query, or SMQ, was developed as a common approach which helps to facilitate retrieval of MedDRA coded data to investigate safety issues in both the post-marketing and clinical environments, right? So SMQs are groupings of terms from one or more MedDRA system organ classes, or SOCs, that relates to a defined medical condition or area of interest, right? They can contain terms to relate to signs and symptoms, say, diagnoses, syndromes, physical findings, lab data, and even other data. So I just put this slide in so you have it as a reference slide, but also just to remind you that a standard MedDRA query is simply, to simplify kind of what I just said, it's simply a grouping of MedDRA terms at the PT or preferred term level, right? They relate to a defined medical condition or are an area of interest. They are intended to help aid in the identification and retrieval of potentially relevant individual case safety reports, as well as they're used for other things as we'll see as we go through this today. So as of version 28.0, and I believe this stays the same in 28.1, which was just released, the current, there are 110 level 1 SMQs in production. So we'll get into what level 1 means. And they range from everything from anaphylactic reaction to hypersensitivity to lack of effect to peripheral neuropathy, shock, to, you can see on the slide all the different types of SMQs that MSSO does have available. So the MSSO does produce another document each year. It's entitled Introductory Guide for Standardized MedDRA Queries, right? And this document is a valuable resource. A lot of times throughout my, past life when I was in industry, a lot of people would not be or weren't aware of this document. So I like to make sure that everyone on this call today, on this webinar, is aware that this document is available. And it does come with your downloaded files each MedDRA release. So unlike where I showed you on the webpage on MedDRA.org, where you can find the points to consider document or the data retrieval document, you will not find this document there. This comes with your release package every 6 months or twice a year, or it will come twice a year, but it gets updated once a year. So if you don't have access to this document, please make sure you reach out to your POC or your point of contact to retrieve a copy. So many organizations actually opt to place this document on a shared drive for everyone in the organization to be able to access. So this is a takeaway. If you never saw this document or never heard of it, maybe it's something you can figure out in your organization how to get a hold of it, and then also, review it. It's actually a really great document. I'll show you it now. I'm just gonna pop up my little here, and I'm gonna go to the SMQ Introductory Guide. And here's what the document looks like. So this was from September of 2025. Like I said, it's updated 28.1. And in it, you'll see it gives a whole background. It goes through all the individual SMQs. It gives lots of detail around everything. We're going to go through it today, but this is just a great reference document for after you get off this webinar and say you want to go back and you want to look at some stuff. It has some figures, it has some tables. And like you could see here, say we want to just see ocular infections, you can literally just click on that and it will take you right to the ocular infections SMQ. It will tell you when the production release took place, and it will give you the definition. It will give you all this information, inclusion, exclusion criteria. It will give you notes on the query, etc. List of references for how the query was developed. So it is a great resource, a tremendous resource, I should say. So again, if you don't have access to this, you never saw this document before, please be sure to reach out to your POC in your organization and get a hold of it, because it's great, and you can save it on your desktop, and then you can use it as need be or just reference it, whatever. Okay, so now we'll move on to SMQ data characteristics. So an SMQ typically provides a broad and a narrow interpretation. So what does that mean? Broad and narrow interpretation are commonly referred to as scope. So we usually say, or I typically usually say, broad or narrow scope. So some SMQs are also available in different forms, including algorithmic. We'll learn more about these forms as we go through the slides today. SMQs are also built and maintained by the MSSO, as was already mentioned. So part of the SMQ maintenance is term status relating to versioning, right? So term status can be a big pain point for organizations. So using SMQs instead of an internally built query takes that maintenance piece away, right? Because anything that changes within an SMQ, whether it be a new term comes on, is added to the dictionary, or a term was made non-current in a dictionary, those changes will be done by the MSSO to the SMQ. And when you get the new version of the SMQ, it will be ready to use. You don't have to do any modifying to it. You don't have to worry about how to version it. So it's actually fantastic. And it takes a lot of the pain piece away and the hard work of trying to figure that out, which I know is there all the time and constantly there when you have a customized query, because you have to do all of that yourself. Oops, okay. So SMQs are constructed at the preferred term level, or PT level, right? So as previously noted, medical coding is performed at the LLT, or lowest level term level, while analysis of data is performed at the PT level. Hence why queries are typically made up of PTs and not LLTs, right? The good thing is when you use a PT in a query, all of the LLTs that fall under that PT are included in that query, because anything coded to an LLT under a specific PT would then be captured. So anything coded to any LLT under any individual PT will be included in that query. You don't have to worry about going and searching, 500 different lowest level terms. You just stick to the preferred term level, and it simplifies it quite a bit. As you can see, the difference in how many LLTs there are compared to PTs, right? So it makes the process a lot easier and a big difference. Also, a couple of slides ago, we saw that there could be a narrow and or a broad scope of SMQs, and I just mentioned it. So what exactly does that mean? So some SMQs only have a narrow scope of terms available, while others also have a broad scope available. So the narrow scope provides groupings of events that are highly likely to represent the condition of interest, whereas the broad scope also includes terms that may have a different origin, right? So thus, a narrow scope yields specificity, while the broad scope yields sensitivity. So that's something to keep in mind. Narrow scope will yield specificity, which makes sense, right? You're narrowing in on something. There's a lot less terms in a narrow scope, right? While the broad scope would yield sensitivity. And in that broad scope yielding sensitivity, some may refer to it as more noise, if you ever heard that term in your organization. I heard it a lot back in the day. People would use it all the time. They say there's too much noise here, too much data that we don't consider super important that we need to look at. So refer to it as noise. And then maybe in that case, then you say, okay, maybe we have to look at the narrow scope instead of a broad scope if it's available for an SMQ. So one important point to note that I used to get asked all the time in my past life is, if I use the broad scope of an SMQ, can I also use the narrow scope? So the answer quite simply is the broad scope of an SMQ also contains all of the narrow scope terms. So if you're using the broad scope, you should use the entire SMQ with broad and narrow both being used. So it's kind of the same concept we just talked about with the preferred term, where if you use a preferred term, you're going to get anything coded to an LLT under a preferred term, it's going to hit. Also, the same is true with the broad scope. If you use the broad scope, the narrow scope will also be included. So an example of this is peripheral neuropathy, right? If you decide that peripheral neuropathy is something your organization is interested in looking into, and you want to cast a wider net of terms for a more sensitive view, you decide to use the broad scope. So all terms under the narrow scope would then also be included. And again, any terms coded to an LLT under a specific PT, they'll always be captured. I like to reiterate that point quite a bit. And I'll show you this in the browser when we get to the demo. I'll go through and I'll show you narrow and broad scope and the terms. And then also, this slide was added to the presentation to serve as a visual representation. A different SMQ, not peripheral neuropathy, but the same concept for what I just discussed, right? And you can clearly see the difference here between the narrow search terms and the broad scope, right? The narrow scope and the broad scope. Look at, there's only 3 terms under the narrow scope, whereas there are a bunch of terms under the broad scope, and even terms like lab terms and things like that included in the broad scope. So you can see where the difference can be seen. So again, the key points: the narrow search strategy maximizes specificity, while the broad search maximizes sensitivity. Okay, so now moving along to some SMQs are designed to use algorithms, or a process or set of rules to be followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations. So typically by a computer. So what does it mean that some SMQs are algorithmic? Well, some side effects are not only diagnosed by the occurrence of a single event, but also by the occurrence of a particular combination of events or symptoms, right? So therefore, some SMQs feature an algorithmic approach that mimics this diagnosis by requiring the presence of combinations of PTs. So the SMQ anaphylactic reaction is an example of an algorithmic SMQ, which we will see more on the next slide. So this slide shows a snapshot of the SMQ anaphylactic reaction. So please note, in case anybody is wondering, that not all PTs were included within this, that are included within this SMQ are listed. Some PTs from B, C, and D are missing because this slide was truncated to fit, on the slide, and not all the information is listed. So it's just a snapshot of some of the information available in the anaphylactic reaction SMQ. So this SMQ includes terms, as you can see, for signs and symptoms of an anaphylactic reaction like rash, and therefore widens the view beyond anaphylactic shock, right? And the more severe manifestations that can be found within the anaphylactoid shock conditions SMQ. So there are 3 scenarios where a case of interest can stem from an algorithmic SMQ. So looking at this slide and then follow along with scenario 1, right? So a case of interest can stem from a match within category A term or in a narrow scope term. So if a case matches with any of these terms in the narrow scope, that would be considered a case of interest, right? Option 2 is a case of interest can stem from a match from a term with category B and a term from category C. So in this case, say you have asthma and you have angioedema, that would be a match because you have a term from category B and a term from category C. And then option 3 would be a case of interest can stem from a match with either category B or C and a match from category D. So either B or C, and then also a term from D. So when looking at the information on this slide, that means that if you are querying your database for a patient with anaphylactic reaction and your search contains a match with your database, terms coded in your database for the PT of circulatory collapse, that would be considered relevant as it comes from the narrow scope of the SMQ. The same is true if your patient data contains the PT of asthma along with a PT of angioedema, like I mentioned. This represents a term from B and C, and then it would be a case of interest. And the same is also true if your search results in a match with angioedema and say from category D, blood pressure decreased, right? As this represents a term from category B and a term from category D. So I know it might seem a lot when you start to first look at it, but it actually is quite simple when you're dealing with the data. And as long as you can always go back and reference this slide and see here, and just to remember that's how cases of interest would be found. And we'll go through a little demo later, and I'll show you in that demo, how we can apply it to, say, real world data. So these patients and cases would then be considered of interest, and they should be investigated further within your organization to determine the next steps. So if you do find a case that matches these and it would be of interest, then your organization would determine what to do for next steps. So using the algorithmic approach helps to find middle ground between the narrow and the broad scope of an SMQ. So one thing to keep in mind is that the algorithms do not provide information around the timing of these events. So that's something that can be internally investigated once the cases are flagged using the algorithmic information provided, right? So application of the algorithm may be most helpful when it is expected that a large number of cases will be retrieved by broad scope terms. So the algorithm may reduce the need for manual sorting for cases of interest. So in other words, it helps to reduce the noise that I was talking about earlier, right? So lots of hits that may come from using the broad scope of an SMQ. It helps to reduce that. So as noted, you should first retrieve the relevant cases by applying the broad scope, and then you would use software to apply the algorithmic approach to screen the cases retrieved. And if you are working with a small data set, this can be done manually. Cases can be filtered by algorithm, either manually or if you're a large organization, programmatically, and that's something internally you would have to figure out within your own organization how to programmatically screen for these terms, and they can be pulled for output. So currently in MedDRA, there are 10 algorithmic SMQs, and they can all be viewed in detail within the browser or within the SMQ introductory guide, which I just showed you, which comes with your package release. So again, the introductory guide would detail these, and you can view them if interested. So I'm providing one last slide to serve as a visual representation of what we just learned. So the graph represents what we discussed in our earlier slides, that if a case falls under category A, narrow, it's a case to review. And again, if it is a case from B and C, or either B or C plus D, then it's a case to review. So lots of reminders here on how the algorithmic SMQs work, and what would be, and how you can find a case of interest. And for me, like I said at the very, very beginning of this webinar, visual representations are always extremely helpful to help remember a concept. So that's why we continue, go through it a couple of times, show a couple of different slides, and hopefully, you know, after the demo and everything, you can start to kind of think about this and how you can apply it to your own internal strategies, to your own internal analysis, etc. And again, if programmatic stuff is done, you may need to get other people involved to help programmatically initiate those SMQs. Okay, so now we're going to transition to the next type of SMQs. So some SMQs are built using a hierarchy. So this hierarchy isn't to be confused with the 5 levels of the MedDRA hierarchy, right, that everyone should be aware of. So it simply means that for a broad medical category, for example, cardiac arrhythmia, sometimes there's a need to have more specific categories underneath. So the main category of one of these hierarchical SMQs is referred to as the superordinate or main overarching SMQ. Any additional category that falls underneath that superordinate SMQ is referred to as the subordinate SMQs, or I like to say sub-SMQs. So an SMQ of this nature may be used for a more inclusive search strategy. So each sub-SMQ can be used as an individual standalone SMQ if your organization's interest is specific and does not require use of the entire SMQ. So again, I'm going to show this on another slide, and you'll get to see what I'm talking about, superordinate, subordinate. But it's just important to note that any sub-SMQ can be used as a standalone. It doesn't always have to be combined with the other SMQs that are available. And within MedDRA, there are 25 of these types of SMQs available. So now, like I said, we'll take a look at an example. So this slide is a visual representation, again, I love my visual cues, of an SMQ that contains a hierarchy. So you can see here, the top row is equivalent to the superordinate SMQ that we just learned about. And this bottom row here is equivalent to the sub-SMQs associated with cytopenias that relate to a more specific topic. So you could see here, overarching, it's cytopenias, and then underneath, maybe a more specific topic, maybe your organization is only interested in leukopenia or thrombocytopenia. And those are available as standalone SMQs if needed. So if an organization chooses to run the entire superordinate SMQ, all sub-SMQs would be included. But as mentioned, any given sub-SMQ can be run against your data as a standalone search. So running a combined search or a standalone search would depend on what type of search you are doing and what type of data you are looking to gather, right? So it's all up to your organization, your team, your coding team, your analysis team, your safety scientists, your physicians, whoever is in charge of doing this. It's up to them to decide what they need to look at. Do they, in this case, maybe need to look at cytopenias as a whole, all 4 categories? Or are they only interested in zoning in on thrombocytopenia, and then maybe they only use this sub-SMQ to find any hits against relevant cases or coded data? Okay, so now we'll move on to SMQ status or term status, right? So each SMQ has a status of active or inactive. So as like with MedDRA LLTs, terms assigned to an SMQ also have a status. So each PT or LLT can be current or non-current. The only difference is once a term is added to an SMQ, it will always be present in that SMQ, even if the status is inactive. So in this case, if a term goes non-current, right, but it's included already in an SMQ, you might go to view that SMQ, which I'll show you when we get to the live demo, and you'll see that that term is still available in the SMQ. It's because, like mentioned here, even if it's inactive, it will still be there. So it's unlike the MedDRA dictionary where, and although if you're using a version of MedDRA, right, and that term is no longer active at all in that version of MedDRA, it should not be used for analysis. And also if it's inactive in the SMQ, it shouldn't, and that's why it's so important to also use the version of the SMQ that matches your data, right? Another point why that's so important. Okay, and the main takeaway from this slide is that the version of the SMQ to be used should match the version of the data being analyzed. So mismatches, again, like I just mentioned, could produce unexpected results as well as missed signals. So this is a very important takeaway, and hence why I stress it so much while I'm giving this webinar. So important because you always should match the version of MedDRA being used. An example of this is the PT, hormone receptor positive breast cancer, right? It was added into the SMQ, breast malignant neoplasms, in version 23 of MedDRA. So if you were to run the version 22.1 SMQ against data that was coded in version 23, it would fail to identify these cases. So this is why it's so important to stay current with and make sure that the version of the SMQ you use matches the version of coded data. And I understand that not all organizations can or do stay current, say in a clinical environment with versions of MedDRA. Maybe you're a couple versions behind, or maybe you have a couple trials running on one version and not another. I know now it's becoming less of a common practice, right, to do that, but there are organizations that still do that. Sometimes it simplifies things, sometimes it's just a resource thing, right? That do use older versions of MedDRA. So that's why this point is also just so important to keep stressing, because if you are one of those organizations and say you do have a trial running on version 27 of MedDRA, to make sure if any analysis is done on that data, that it's also done in version 27, using those SMQs that fall in version 27 and not in version 28.1, which just got released. So very, very important to keep in mind. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go through some benefits and limitations of SMQs, then I'll pause for some questions in case there are any. But SMQs also have limitations as well as benefits. So some benefits are they have applications across multiple therapeutic areas. They're validated, like I mentioned. They provide a way to have standardized communication of safety information. They also allow for a consistent data retrieval. And the best part is, like I mentioned many times here, they don't require any maintenance on your end. So the MSSO does all of the maintenance for you, which is unbelievably great, especially when dealing with lots and lots of different SMQs or big data sets and lots of analysis on those data sets. There are some limitations with regards to SMQs. So they don't cover all medical topics or safety issues, and they do undergo some changes, even though they have been thoroughly tested, which in some people actually wouldn't consider that a limitation, because as we know, MedDRA is a living, breathing dictionary and changes do take place. So maybe sometimes it's a change. Obviously, it's a change that was needed and a change for the better. So even though they do undergo some changes, it's actually, some may not consider that a limitation. But they don't cover all medical topics, hence why there's still so much need around creating CMQs. I mean, the more we go through in the MedDRA process, more and more SMQs are getting added, but it doesn't always necessarily cover everything, right? Okay, so before we move into this next topic, as promised, I'll take a little pause here, give your ears a break, and see if there are any questions.
Yes, we have one for right now. I think it was slide 27 when this one came in. I don't know. But it says, if I understand correctly, the company must prepare its queries to apply to its own database, and it is not possible to apply this to the MedDRA platform like MVAT.
So for queries, yeah, you would have to have your data set. I'm going to actually show you a tool where you can apply your data against SMQs. So if we can just pause this question till I do the live, till I go through the tool, I should say, because I am going to do a live browser demo, but then I'm also going to show you an SMQ analysis tool that the team here at the MSSO, they're very good with these tools. It's a tremendous tool. We're going to go through it in a little bit so I can show you how you can use that tool to apply your data against it and get different outcomes. And I'll show you what's needed to do that. But yes, for say the programmatic piece I was talking about, say if you want to programmatically do large data sets in-house, that's something that you would have to do internally, obviously, because we're not going to receive your data and be able to use your data and then spit out outputs for your data for you. You know, it's something you have to kind of do on your own, but we do give tools to help with that. So I think that answers the question. Are there any additional ones?
That's the only one that we have for right now.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll continue on now with SMQ applications. Okay, so in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, clinical trials where a safety profile may not yet be established, multiple SMQs can be used on a routine basis, kind of as a screening tool, right? So which SMQs are used depends on what your organization is screening for. If you're screening for cardiac failure, you may choose to use the broad or narrow scope of the SMQ cardiac failure. So selected SMQs may also be used to evaluate previously identified issues, say from preclinical data or a class effect. So there are many different applications for SMQs in the early stages of medication development or clinical development, right? And then in phase 4, as we know, post-marketing, selected SMQs can be used to retrieve cases for a suspected or known safety issue. They can also be used for signal detection, single case alerts, and periodic reporting. For example, the periodic safety update reports, or PSURs, where special situations like lack of effect, overdose, and pregnancy may be looked at. In my past life, I used to work with the PSUR group quite a bit. Every MedDRA upgrade, I would work with them. We would go through, you know, we would identify issues like this, and we would use MSSO SMQs to run against the data to see what would pop out or what would be of interest on these special situations. So a very important piece. I'm not sure how much everyone on the call works with, say, the PSUR group or works with this, but it just keep in mind, these are applications where it can be very important in a post-marketing or safety environment to use these SMQs. Okay, so now I'm going to move along to go to the demo I promised that I would be doing. So today I'll be using the desktop browser. You can follow along on the web-based browser. The only reason I chose to use this is in case, you know, there's any issue with the internet. I'm just using this, but you can follow along. It's the same thing. If you go, when you open your web-based browser, if you go to browser view, what you want to do here, the default is to go to system organ class or SOC. What you're going to do is switch it over to SMQ. And once you do that, you click on this, it's going to automatically switch over to the SMQ view, right? So this is the main focus for today's presentation, hence why we'll be looking at this view. Just want to show you before we even take a look at any specific SMQs, you might be saying, okay, so what do I need to see? How can I figure out, say I'm interested in headache, right? As something to see where would headache pop, or let's just say, actually, let's say rash. Which SMQs would rash pop up in? So you have a starting point of, you know, you have this term, you have this concept, medical concept that you're interested in of rash, right? You would come here to the search bar, you would type in rash, and then you hit search. As soon as you hit search, I'm doing it at the PT level for rash. You can also do it at the LLT level, but again, remember, analysis is done at the PT level. So I typed in just a generic rash. So I'm going to get everything down here is all terms that contain the word rash, right? So we have a general rash. We might have an injection site rash if your company is using injections and say that would be your main focus. And what you would do is you would open it up. So let's start with rash. Say that's your interest. You just click on the plus sign here, and you could see what SMQs the term, the PT rash would fall under. So that could be a good starting point for SMQs that might be of interest to your organization. So you could see here, DRAS came up, anaphylactic reaction came up, hypersensitivity came up. And again, say injection is your company focus, your organization focuses on injections, and that's, your main interest. So again, you just come over here to the plus sign, you open it up. Okay, so injection site rash, as of right now, current version 28.1, it's only available in the SMQ hypersensitivity. Okay, so now you say, okay, I am interested in anaphylactic reactions related to rash. So how do I see that in the browser? So you just click on the anaphylactic reaction, you right click on it, and then you get all these options here. What you would want to do if you want more information around the SMQ to say, okay, do I want to actually use that SMQ or not? You would click the open details and occurrences. Sorry, I'm working on 2 screens, so it popped open on my other screen. Here it is. And you could see here, you'll get a description of the SMQ. You'll get the sources, the notes on how the SMQ was developed. And as you can see, what we spoke about earlier, it gives you the algorithm that's used for the SMQ, since it is an algorithmic SMQ. And it also gives that information up here. But now you say, okay, great, the description's great, it's fine, but I want to see what terms are also underneath the anaphylactic SMQ. So what you would do is right click again, just click go to browser. It will take you right here to the SMQ anaphylactic reaction, where you would then, it would be highlighted. And again, here's a plus sign on the left-hand side. So what you would do is just open that plus sign, and all the terms under the anaphylactic SMQ will be listed, right? And you can follow along with me if you like in your browser. And again, now we know that this is an algorithmic SMQ, right? So we see different things here. We see the PT in blue, then we see PT in red with the letter B attached. Also, if we scroll down, we see it with the letter C attached. Some of them have a red square around it. So what does that mean? So basically, you can come here to your legend. I'm going to pull this over. Sorry, popped up on my other screen. And you can see here that a PT that's in blue, which are these here, would mean it's narrow scope and it's active. So that's current in the current SMQ. If you scroll down and you want to see what PTs are available, you see here the PTB, right? That's a broad scope with category and it's active. So the categories we went through earlier in the presentation, and you see it's active. And now you see the red square around this one. That means that if it has a red square around it, it's inactive, right? And it's not currently being used in this SMQ. So that's a term you would not want to run your data against, any inactive terms. And you say, okay, well, why is it showing if it's inactive? Well, what you can do here, quite simply, and this legend is always available in all our browsers, so you don't have to worry about memorizing any of this. You'll have it available. Just remember, the main thing to remember is blue is narrow and red is broad, right? And then when you get into an SMQ like this, where there's an algorithm, there'll also be letters attached. But what you can do here is up in the display options, and it will vary, depending on what browser you are using. But what you want to do is you can shut off all non-current terms, and you can also shut off inactive terms, so you just don't see them, right? So you don't accidentally make a mistake of maybe using a term that shouldn't be used in that particular SMQ. So again, you can come here to rash, you can open it up, go to anaphylactic reaction and click go to browser. Open it up again with the plus sign, and now you can see as we scroll through, all those terms with the square around them are gone, making it much easier to distinguish what should be used if you're using this SMQ to run against your data. Now, another good feature is you can come here and you can add the SMQ to your research bin. You can right click on it on the anaphylactic reaction. You can click add to research bin, and it will be added to your research bin, where you can then easily export that. And you can see here there are options. So with secondary SOC, with HLT, and with HLGT, and you can just click export. Now in this case, oops, hold on one second. I just got it. My browser disappeared. Okay, in this case, what we will do is we'll clear this. I'm actually going to show you how to get all the terms when you're exporting. So say you're interested in anaphylactic reaction, but you're only interested in the broad scope. What you would do here is just highlight the first term, hold your shift key down, go down to the last term, the type 1 hypersensitivity, and then right click on it and go to add to research bin. And you could see here, all those terms just from the narrow scope were added. And then you can then easily click export. It's going to pop up on my other screen. Give me 1 second. I'll pull it over. And you can see here that all the PTs from the narrow scope were added to the SMQ spreadsheet. And you can filter this as needed. You could keep it to just primary and shut the secondary off like we saw. There's a feature. You can also filter that out if you don't want it, and then you will have all the PTs with the MedDRA code and the terms available for you. So that's one great feature of the browser. Again, there's an SMQ analysis tool, which we'll get to in a little bit, that will answer a question that was received earlier. And then also I want to show you just, we'll go to peripheral neuropathy, the SMQ that we talked about earlier in the webinar. So if we go down to peripheral neuropathy, and we open this up, you can see here without an algorithm, you can just see straight, broad, narrow, and broad terms. So you could see there's no letters attached to these terms. And again, you can look at it to see what meets your organization's needs. Do I need to look from a more broad perspective, or do we need to zone in and just use the narrow scope for this? So that's something, again, we at the MSSO can't determine. You within your organization will have to do that. And again, we give you the tools you need to kind of do this day to day and be able to use these, but we can't necessarily, give you all the information on how your organization should go about using it, as that's information that needs to be determined internally. Okay, and here's an example of a hierarchy, SMQ with a hierarchy. So cardiac arrhythmias, you could see here when you click the plus sign here, it would open up and more SMQs open up underneath. These are the sub SMQs that are available under cardiac arrhythmias. So see here, we'll go to, say we want to look at arrhythmias related investigation signs and symptoms. Then we would open up that sub SMQ and see what falls underneath it. But say we're interested in looking at cardiac arrhythmia terms, right? We can see here that they open up and more, that sub SMQ opens up into more sub SMQs to get more specific. And then say we just want to look at a general level, just cardiac arrhythmia terms, non-specific, you would just open that plus sign and then you would get what you need. And you can see here, this not only is a sub SMQ, but it also only contains narrow scope of terms, right? There's no broad scope available there. So just to give you an idea of how to use it. So again, you can have a starting point. Say you're interested in, heart attack or myocardial infarction, we'll say MI. You just can type it in, click, and see what SMQs contain it. Simple as that. And then you can go over to the left and you can open these up and kind of look around, see all the different styles of SMQ, etc. So that's our little browser demo that we'll do that we had for today. Just to help you kind of navigate through the browser. I showed you how to go through and kind of shut off the inactive PT so you don't accidentally incorporate that into your SMQ output. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to check to see if there are any questions. We're going to go into the analysis tool now that was asked about earlier.
We did get one, and they just said, is it acceptable to use one MedDRA version for the entire clinical trial, or should we update it every 6 months? Could differences between the versions lead to terminology inconsistencies or misunderstandings?
Okay, so that's a very good, a very complicated question that really I can't answer for you. We do have guidance around that, and some of our webinars, or actually even our user group meetings, we touch on this a lot. If you have an opportunity to attend a user group meeting, we usually touch upon versioning, but that's something that internally your organization has to decide upon, right? As you saw from the example I gave earlier, just whatever your organization decides, use the version of the SMQ run it against your data, the version that your data's in. So while you will make that decision internally on whether you want to continue to update the versions during clinical trials, you want to hold the version, you want to, we have many options available for how to version, which I can't unfortunately get into today because we're focusing on SMQs, but that's something internally you need to decide. So any other questions?
Nope, that was all.
Okay, great. All right, so now we're going to go on to the analysis tool, and I'll show you another quick little demo. Okay, so how to run SMQs. So this is more technical piece. So from an IT perspective, an SMQ is simply a stored query, right? It's a query that's stored in your IT cloud or whatever you use. So most organizations code and store data as LLTs, right? The SMQ ASCII files include both PTs and LLTs. So to run a query, an SMQ would be loaded into a query tool and then run against the coded MedDRA terms to check for any matches or hits in a database. So I'm going to go through a series of slides now that just detail information, and then I'm actually going to demo it. So don't worry about, trying to figure out, remember all the stuff, the information I'm giving. But this slide details the location of where you can find the SMQ analysis tool within the browser. So a properly formatted Excel spreadsheet should be used to run all terms. And the default for the tool is to run all terms against all available SMQs. But please note, we do have a drop-down menu available. I'll show you this when I do the demo within the tool that allows users to confine their search to a narrow, broad, or algorithmic search input. And the analysis tool allows for you to run a broad search of a particular SMQ, or it allows you to run it multiple SMQs or all SMQs against your data set, like the sample we provided here. So you run it against the broad search for all SMQs. And again, this will make more sense when I show you the demo. And then these slides are really just to keep for visual purposes before I show you the demo, and then also so you have as a reference. And then this slide serves as a visual for a broad search done on all SMQs against the data set. So a broad search, again, contains all narrow terms, hierarchical terms, as well as any algorithmic analysis. And again, I will demo this. And again, this screenshot is truncated. So there are a lot more columns that fall off to the right over here, but unfortunately, they don't fit in the slide in PowerPoint. So we had to truncate it. Okay, and then this slide again is just a visual representation of the results of an algorithmic SMQ that were run against a data set. Again, I will show this in the demo and it will hopefully make more sense. I know it could be a lot, but then you can go back and you can practice with your own data, running it against the tool or in the tool. And then before we move on to the live demo using the analysis tool, let's discuss the SLE SMQ. It's the only SMQ available in MedDRA that's what we call a weighted SMQ. So as you can see from the screenshot taken, and from the SMQ introductory guide, if you take a look at that, it is from the SMQ introductory guide, I should say. So if you do look at that guide, you will find this screenshot in there. There are 9 categories available for a weighted SMQ, and each category carries a different weight. So what exactly does that mean? I'll show you. So the weight for the broad terms was developed empirically and related to the frequency of terms and the probability that these relate to the well-known occurrence of SLE, right? So the algorithm is applied as follows. The PTs mentioned in the case report are grouped according to the predetermined categories that I showed on the last slide. So if multiple PTs from within a category are present, they are counted only once. And the category that the term is attributed to is then multiplied by its empirically predetermined weight and summed for all categories. If the sum is greater than 6, it is proposed that the case report qualifies as a suspected SLE case report and should be retrieved. And this may be better learned by seeing a live example as I will provide in the demo. So I'll go back to this slide real quick and you can see they're all given categories and then they're given weights. And this can all, if you're interested in what the categories are and what the weight equivalates to, you can definitely reference this in the SMQ introductory guide that I showed you earlier that you need to get from your POC. We're not going to go into detail on that today, but they do come with weights. And these weights will be important when I do my live demo. I'll show you how to go through them. So we went through this slide. And then this slide just details a sample data set that we'll be using for our demonstration purposes today. So now what I'm going to do is go to the more fun thing, go to the live demo. But first, I want to show you what the Excel looks like that is used. And this is what you would use for your own data, right? So this is just dummy data, right? Because I'm doing a demo today for a large group of people that all have come from different organizations and have different data, right? But if you were to develop your own Excel to use in this SMQ analysis tool, this is how you would have to do it. You would need a row ID here. It's actually not needed, but I always like to use a row ID. Then you would need your term, which in this case is a preferred term. So you would go get your data, all the preferred terms that you want to look at that were coded already. And these are preferred terms that kicked out that you need to look at. You would have that in column B. Column C, you would need the MedDRA code for these terms, which can be found in the browser. As I showed earlier, every even SMQ has a code attached. But if you go here, there are codes attached to every P preferred term as well. So you would need that. And this can be, once you code a term in the system, don't get too scared of this, like it sounds like it's too much, because every time you code a term and the PT is in the system, the code should also be stored in the system and available. So that would just need to be extracted for you, and then you can copy paste it into the Excel for the terms you need to look at. And then a case ID should be attached, right? If you're looking at cases, the ID should be attached. So here you can see, let's look at patient case ID 14 here. They have 3 terms associated with their case. Here you have case ID 12. They have 4 terms that were coded within that case. So that's all you would need, just a formatted Excel like that. And that's the one I'll be using today for the demo. So now I'm going to go back into the browser. I'm going to go to the SMQ. It doesn't really matter if you do or not, but I'm just going to go there. I'm going to click the SMQ analysis tool. Just can you bear with me one second? Popped up on my other screen. Pull it over, and you could see here, this is what the tool looks like. So you can see that all SMQs are listed. So if you're only interested in, say, hypersensitivity, you would just highlight hypersensitivity before you do anything else. Up here, you would use your version and what language you would like. I'm using current version 28.1, and I'm also looking at English. And then here you could see there's different search types. So you could search just narrow, you can run against just broad, or you could do an algorithmic search, right? So say you want to do narrow and just hypersensitivity. So it tells you here what to do. You would just keep that on narrow. You would hold your shift key, just click on hypersensitivity, and then click next. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to clear this because for the demo I want to run against, I'm going to start with the broad search. I'm going to run my data against every single SMQ available in MedDRA, including the sub-SMQs we discussed and the sub-SMQs, if there are some available. So I'm just going to run it against everything. So then you just simply, you put it on broad, you have your version in your language, you just simply click next. After that, you go to browse. I am going to use my dummy data that I showed you all. I'm going to click open. Simple as that. You have your Excel ready to be uploaded. Then you click next. Look how quick that was to pop up, right? So we have our dummy data. Hold on one second. Let me go here. I'm actually going to switch it to version 28. I think this wasn't cleared, so I'm going to clear it again. Give this 1 second to pull up. It pulls up. Okay. I'm going to make sure everything is cleared out. I want to use everything, and then broad search. Next, my Excel is already there. I'm going to click next again. Here we go. Okay, this is what I was looking for. I still had the hypersensitivity clicked. So in this case, this is the output you would get. So everything in your dummy data was run against every single SMQ in the broad scope, and this is what you get. So the first thing I would do here, first you could save this Excel to your desktop or wherever you want it saved. But what I always do is I'll add a filter to this Excel. So you simply just highlight the row with the ID and all that, and you go to filter, and you just click add filter, right? Now we'll have that for when we're looking at stuff. What I wanted to show you though, before I even filter anything, is that for acute kidney injury here in the broad scope, it's important to note, look at this, the acute kidney injury actually hit at all these different SMQs, right? And in this case, it hit, if you could see here in the title, the SMQ level 1, the main overarching superordinate SMQ of shock, it actually went against acute kidney injury 6 different sub SMQs, right, that you can look at. And if you keep scrolling over, you can see here, it will tell you the level 2 SMQ that it actually hit against. And again, you can filter this to any way you need it. So you could see here, acute kidney injury, look how many different SMQs it does hit when you use the broad scope and you search against all SMQs. You can also see there's a category here for the A, B, C, and D as for algorithmic search. And then there's active, broad and narrow, of course. So you can filter this any way you like. But for today's demo purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to filter out the SMQ of SLE. So I'm going to deselect all. I'm only focused on the SLE, the one we talked about, the weighted SMQ. So here it is. So I'll just click on that. I'll click OK. And it will pull up all the terms that the PTs that hit against, the LTs, PTs that hit against this SMQ. So you can see here, we have the PT, we have all the codes available, and then we say, okay, hit here broad, it hit narrow. And does everyone remember, if we have, for the weighted SMQ, if it's more than 6, it's a case that needs to be looked at. So here you can clearly see that what hits against, we could see here, the case ID, that's why it's so important to have your case ID. Case 14, which I pointed out earlier, you could see here, if you add up the weight, 3, 4, and 7 total, this would be a case where you would need to filter it out and perform more analysis. It's something that would need to be looked at from from a deeper analysis perspective, right? Because the weight would be, it would be a potential case of interest because the weight is greater than 6 here for this case. And you could see here, if we come down to 15, it also has 3 hits, right? Case ID 15, but it goes up to 6 here, so it's not greater than 6. And of course, for a case 13, it only hits against the narrow, so the weight is 0. So in this case, case ID 14 would be the one that would need to be looked at further. Okay, so that's just to show you how to use the weighted SMQ and how it could come in handy for identifying cases of interest. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get rid of this. I'm going to go back here to the measure version. I'm going to switch the view to the narrow scope view, just making sure everything's clear. I don't want and I'm going to run the same data against only the narrow scope, not the broad scope of all SMQs though. And you could see here how different the data looks, right? In this case, even there's no match. Say for blood creatinine increased, there's no match, no SMQ matched, no match for any of these lab terms, which makes sense, right? Because we're looking from a more narrow, restrictive view. And so you can see that's where the differences fall and how much different the data looks. And again, and everything here is category A. Remember, we discussed the narrow category, no weights associated. And then if there is more than one SMQ level, it will be listed here. So you can see depression and suicide. One falls under depression, one falls under suicide over here for major depression and suicidal ideation. So that's that's what data would look like from a narrow scope. And now what I'm going to do again is I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to measure version and I'm going to switch this to an algorithmic search. So we can see how the data looks when we're looking at it from an algorithmic perspective. And I'm just going to click next. And then again, my data is already loaded. You would have to load yours in. Click next. And here's what the data looks like from an algorithmic search. So again, only would pull up SMQs that actually contain an algorithm, right? And the SLE is here because it's weighted. And then anaphylactic reaction, as we saw earlier and we talked about, you can see here that the categories are listed. We do have a hit anaphylactic shock against the narrow scope. So that would be, again, a case of interest, right? It falls under category A. And then this would be category B and C, right? So this, again, would be of interest. And then you can do B, C, or D within the same case And here you can see case 12 does contain term from B and D. So it really hits all the criteria for an algorithmic search. And again, this is just for demo purposes. So you see this, but you see how you can apply it against your own data. So again, it would be your coded data. And what you would need is the LLT or PT term and the LLT or PT code. I recommend using PTs since that's the level analysis is done at. And then you can see what hits you get, what SMQs it hits against, and how you can start to apply it in your own organization and use it. So it's as simple as that. The tool is great. You saw how quick this is in real time right now. It's not something that I did ahead of time. The only thing we did was build the Excel. So we had dummy data. We did not, all this stuff I ran right now was in real time. So you can see how quick, if somebody comes to you and say, you have 24 hours to kind of run data against this SMQ, you can kind of see, you can use this tool to help do that, or guide whoever, the programmers or whoever would need to use this tool to do that. So just, and that's that for the demo. So with that being said, we're going to get to the last. I'm going to pause real quick to see if there are any questions. And then I'm going to get to 2 quick scenarios, and then we will be moving along. So Sarah, are there any questions on anything that was just discussed?
Yes, we have a couple. You might have just answered this one, but it says, what's the file that I have to upload to do the SMQ analysis, and where can I get it?
Yeah, so that I went through already. If you recall, I showed you the sample one that I used dummy data for. I'm going to pull it up real quick. You would have to do this with your own data. So it's not something you can get. It's something internally you have to build. And I went through how to build it, so I won't do that again. And this would be your data would already be coded, and these would be the PTs from that coded data that you would put in here along with the code. And then you would upload that as I showed you in the tool using the SMQ analysis feature. And when you get to this next step, this is where you would upload it. You browse and you just upload the Excel. Okay?
Perfect.
Any other questions?
The other one was, it says, is the weight only applicable to SLE?
Correct. It's the only weighted SMQ available to help identify cases of interest in that SMQ. And I don't know why it's the only way. I don't have the information off the top of my head, but it is the only, I can tell you it's the only one weighted. And doesn't mean that there maybe won't be additional weighted SMQs in the future, but right now it's the only one. Any other questions?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, now we're going to just go to 2 quick scenarios. So in scenario 1, just to kind of drive home everything we talked about today, you can see it from a scenario perspective. So scenario 1, we're working for a company that started the development of a new drug for onychomycosis, right? It's projected to take 8 years and cost $1.2 billion. So what exactly are we developing? Well, we're developing a medication for toenail fungus. I know that's a gross picture, but just to show you a visual for what we're actually talking about. So in doing your due diligence with regards to the safety of the drug, you decide to potentially run SMQs for SAEs against your data. So in doing this, you identify 5 possible cases of hemolytic anemia in 1,000 patient exposures. So identifying these cases, you decide there is an unfavorable risk-benefit ratio and suggest stopping the drug development, remembering that your drug is for toenail fungus. So in this case, having cases of hemolytic anemia would not be worth the risk, right? So this is where SMQs can help. So after suggesting that the drug development be stopped, your management reviews the data and a risk benefit and follows your recommendations, saving time, money, and potential patient risk. Now we all know it's not that quick and simple and easy, but it's just for demonstrative purposes today and to show you that these SMQs can really be super beneficial when dealing with stuff like this, because that's how you were able to catch that a drug for toenail fungus was causing hemolytic anemia, and the benefit risk might not be ideal, right? So you might want to, it might be something your organization wants to look into. So in scenario 2, you're developing a 4th drug in a therapeutic class. Other products in this class are associated with the development of high blood pressure and angioedema. However, given the seriousness of the target disease, it's an acceptable risk. So in this case, the risk is acceptable. So in this scenario, knowing the associated risk, you decide to routinely run the SMQs for angioedema and hypertension against your development and post-marketing data on your product. Over time, it becomes clear that your drug is not associated with either of these risks, as was seen for the other drugs in your therapeutic class. So now in this case, your diligence has now given patient a safer alternative for the treatment of their disease. So again, congratulations, job well done. And again, we all know it's not that quick, it's not that simple, it's not that easy. However, we're just showing you how it can be applied and how these tools, SMQs and something like the SMQ analysis tool and the other tools the MSSO provides can be used to help with this. Okay, so before we move on to our last topic, well, actually, I'm just going to move on to the last topic because it's really quick, and then I'll do questions. I was going to stop, but so we will not, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about customized queries, but we're not going to go into detail, a lot of detail around SMQs or customized MedDRA queries today, as the data analysis and query building class goes in depth. And like I mentioned, Dr. Dave just did that webinar last week. We also go into depth. We have face-to-face classes around this full day for SMQs and data analysis, where we go more depth. However, one of the most important points that came up often in my past life, very often, almost daily, is the point that if an SMQ is modified, it can no longer be considered an SMQ as it becomes a non-standard. Very, very, very important point to note. If you are using an SMQ in your organization and you even remove one PT from that SMQ, because somebody says, okay, we don't need to look at that PT, it's no longer an SMQ. You can't call it an SMQ. It shouldn't be called an SMQ. It can't be used as an SMQ, and it's not going to be maintained like an SMQ. It would then become a customized MedDRA query. So keep that in mind when you are using these SMQs, and when you're developing your own CMQs, you can use an SMQ as a starting point, and if you need to modify it for any reason, it then becomes a CMQ, and you must maintain it. You must store it. You must do everything for it within your organization. So that's a very, very, very important point to keep in mind. So in order to create customized searches or ad hoc queries, medical knowledge is needed, as well as knowledge of the structure and characteristics of MedDRA and your data. So the MedDRA data retrieval and presentation PTC should be used, the one I showed you earlier, way back, seems like a week ago, at the beginning of the presentation. And queries should also always be saved, stored, and maintained within future MedDRA versions. So you should always store and maintain somewhere, find a place on SharePoint or whatever your organization uses to store these queries. And then if you are versioning, or if these queries are for post-marketing, and post-marketing has to stay current with the current version of MedDRA, these queries that are built internally need to be maintained with future versions. So if you build a query in version 27.1 and it's a customized query, you remove 3 terms from an SMQ, or you just straight out built it yourself, you then need to save that and maintain it, because once your post-marketing department or drug safety department goes to the current version of MedDRA, that query needs to also go to the current version of MedDRA. And one other thing I used to get all the time when I was in my past life is, why can't we just use it? And I showed you today through this presentation why it shouldn't just be used, right? Signals can be missed, things change, you need to keep it current. So if your data is current, keep it current. If your data is on 27.1 and nothing changes and you don't have post-marketing where you need to worry about currency, then you're in clinical department and your trial is staying on 27.1 throughout the length of the trial, then that query should stay on 27.1. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is, if you are building these CMQs or customized MedDRA queries, please consider submitting them to the MSSO. We do have a process available for how to do that. I've submitted a few back in my day. It also helps the MSSO to understand maybe where areas of interest are. Now, let me reiterate, it does not mean that everything you submit will get turned into an SMQ. It just means that we have tools available. If your organization is using it, you think it's something that not only your organization would use, but you think it's something that would benefit many organizations and something that, you know, just isn't touched upon in what we currently have, then yes, you can consider submitting it. And there are rules around that, which we won't get into today. But I mean, it is a good thing to keep in mind, right? Maybe 30 organizations will benefit from it. It's something that the MSSO will consider putting a lot of time and effort into to build, and then in the future, you will have your SMQ and it will be maintained by the MSSO. So in summary, today we reviewed the data retrieval and presentation PTC. We discussed the characteristics, applications, benefits of SMQs, including customizations. I know we went through a lot of information today, so I would recommend, if a topic doesn't seem clear at first, maybe go back and you can reference this presentation. As Sarah mentioned, it's going to be stored on the YouTube channel, so you can go back and you can reference it there and listen to it, kind of look at the slides. You know, you can always take another class in the future just to refresh yourself on any of this information. If it's been a while, you know, you let this sit for a while in your brain, and then day to day takes over, and a year from now you need to do something with it and you forget. You can always take a course again, or you could go to a face-to-face, or you can go to the YouTube video and watch. If you enjoyed hearing me today, go through it. We also have some contact information we always provide at the end of all of our webinars, face-to-face classes. We have our website, which we went to several times today. We have the help desk email in case you run into any issues and you need to contact them. We have the link for the browsers. We also have our training schedule, which I think most of you are familiar with since you're all here today. And we have our supporting documentation. So you can use this link to click on the supporting documentation. I'll click on it now. As you can see, it takes you where I took you earlier, where you can reference the version 28 information, or even other information, as well as you can click on PTC and get this information as well, which we saw earlier. So, and with that being said, we have reached the end of our webinar today. So I want to pause and ask Sarah, are there any additional questions that we need to answer before we head out today?
Someone just asked, is there a plan to add AI in the MedDRA website?
I don't know how to answer that question. I'm not sure what is meant by add AI, but you know, as things evolve in the outside world, outside the MSSO, I'm sure things within the MSSO might evolve as well. Right now, we have what we have, what's available. So I can't really, that's not a question I can really answer. So I'm not sure what kind of AI is even asked to be incorporated, but I know there's a lot of work around AI in all kinds of organizations at this moment. So any other questions?
Not at this time, no.
Okay, great. So we have reached the end of the presentation. I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you to everyone. I know how busy everyone can be and how hard it is sometimes to take an hour and a half out of your busy day to come listen to me talk about SMQs. So from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope the demos helped. And just think, we're already at Wednesday, so we are more than halfway through the week right now, looking at the weekend. And I just want to say one last thing is that there will be a survey coming out that Sarah will be so kind to send to all of you once this presentation is done. It takes about, I don't know, 2 minutes to fill out. If you can do so, that would help us out tremendously. We use that information for future planning and future sessions and etc. So, and the trainers use it. You know, I look at it to see what everyone has to say. It's anonymous, and it would be very helpful, so we would appreciate it. But with that being said, just want to say thank you very much again. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and hope to see you all at a face-to-face class, a user group, something in person in the future soon. Thank you.